Hello, everybody. My name is Camilla, and I'm here to talk to you about translation for foreign markets. So let's get started. First, a little bit about my background. I was born in Zimbabwe. I grew up in Australia, and I've lived in the Netherlands and Belgium for the last 17 years. And I live here with my two partners and our three children. My first contact with another language than my own was with Shona, one of the African languages that is spoken in Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, I didn't get much of an opportunity to learn it because we moved to Australia fairly soon, but it sparked an interest in learning other languages, which I could then follow up when I went to high school, where I learned French. And I nursed all kinds of dreams about one day living in France and being able to speak it like a native. However, life took me in a different direction, and I now speak Dutch as my second language. I worked for 20 years as an editor. I worked mainly for people who were writing English as a second language, and that was my first realization that your native language can have an effect on the type of English that you write. And that was to prove handy later when I switched careers and became a translator. And I've been working now as an in-house translator for a translation agency for 6 years. I translate from Dutch into English. I work primarily on nonfiction text, but I occasionally also get the opportunity to work on literary text, which I really love. For example, I've translated a book on learning a particular musical instrument, which I can't tell you about because of non-disclosure agreement. And I've also translated a children's fairy tale. I really love translating fiction. I also translate for my partners, by the way, who are both Dutch speakers. And I enjoy the challenge of producing a text in English that I hope readers will enjoy just as much as the Dutch readers enjoyed the original. And as much as the translator George Sturtis says, I listen intently for the timbre of the voice and seek a comparable voice in English that might bring to English the experience a native reader might have in Hungarian. That's pretty much what I'm going for too. Okay, in this talk, I'm going to tell you a bit about what translation involves. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about finding the right translator for your project, and then how the translation project proceeds. Just want to say at this point that I haven't ever worked through a publishing house. So what I'm talking about here is a sort of one-to-one contact between writer and translator, which was, I imagine, quite different from publishing house, where the publishing house will mediate. The first part is, what does translation involve? Well, a few years ago, someone on Twitter posted a tweet inviting people to poorly describe their profession. And I came up with, I turn words into other words, and felt pretty smug about myself. Although it's essentially true, there's actually much more to translation than a simple one-to-one switching of words. Edith Grossman put it very nicely when she said, there is no such thing as a literal translation. Languages are entirely different systems, and you can't impose Spanish on English or vice versa. English has its own structure and its own lexicon, and Spanish has its own structure and its own lexicon, and they don't occupy the same space. In fact, a translation can be considered as much a piece of creative writing as the original text. Okay, so when you consider a piece of writing, there are a variety of elements involved. First of all, there are the words and sentences and paragraphs. Those are the visible building blocks of your text. But there's also a lot of invisible stuff. So, for example, there's the writer's background, which is made up of their culture that they come from, their psychology, the experiences they've had, their worldview, the assumptions that they hold, and their social position. There is also the culture in which the writing is steeped, so that's shaped the writing. For example, the history of a language in a country can have a big effect on the way people write. There are also idioms and expressions that are unique to a particular culture, and I've got an example here from Dutch. The Netherlands has been a seafaring country for a large part of its history. There's an awful lot to do with ships and sailing and that kind of thing, and that's found its way into the language. They have an extraordinary number of expressions that are about ships. And one of them is Van Stapel laten lopen, which is about launching a ship. And that has gradually become the expression niet te hard van stapel lopen, which is often used after people have been sick or have been injured. And if you translate it literally, it means don't run too fast off the pile, which sounds like utter nonsense. But when you consider it in its context, it makes sense, because it's just a way of saying don't be too hasty, don't overdo things, don't rush in before you're ready. And I just really love that aspect of finding out what an expression means and then finding the English expression to match it. Another thing to consider is the author's intended audience, which influences the register. And that's the language that they choose. So the complexity of the language, the formality, the choices of vocabulary. A very sort of rough comparison to show you what that means is if you take, for example, the children's book, The Gruffalo, and put it next to Lord of the Rings, you've got a pretty massive difference in register. And that's based on who the authors are writing for and the language they use and the complexity of the story and all that kind of thing. Another thing to consider is usage that is unfamiliar to people to readers in other languages. That's unique ways of writing things. And for example, I've chosen here Dutch brackets, which this is something that you see all over the place in the Netherlands. And what it is basically is a really efficient way of compacting a lot of words down to one word. The word bromfietsen here, it's actually represents motor scooters and bicycles, but because the word fiets appears both in the word for motor scooter and for bicycle, all they've had to do is put those brackets in there to show you that they mean two different kinds of vehicles. And it's incredibly efficient and really good for signage. So basically, as a whole, translation is about finding a good balance between producing a good and comprehensible text in the target language while keeping and conveying the meaning of it in the source language. For example, I've got a book, The Cat Who Saved Books, by Sosuke Natsukawa. There's a Japanese author, and it's been translated into English. But there's no mistaking that it's a Japanese book about a Japanese character, because the translator has made a really conscious effort to ensure that that comes across well by the choices of words and the way things are described. In my opinion, a good translation enables readers to experience different worlds and cultures as wholly and truthfully as possible, but in their own language. Moving on to the next part, assuming now you want to translate your own writing. As I mentioned before, I'm assuming that you are independently looking for a translator rather than going through a publisher. So you're thinking about having your writing translated. That's great, because it's a fantastic way for people from different cultures to share stories. But perhaps more specifically, you're aware that there's a market for your writing in another country or another language group, and you'd like to get your stories out there. So what do you need to know? First of all, finding a translator, probably one of the most important things, if not the most important, is that the translator should be a native speaker of the target language. And if possible, be living in the country where it's spoken, or at least have daily contact with the language. That's important because it means that they're basically embedded in the language. When you grow up with the language, it becomes almost part of your body and your being. And that means that you're able to express yourself well in it. And that's really important when you're translating a text. It's interesting to note, if you live in a country where you are surrounded by a foreign language, it's often the case that your native language starts to become contaminated with your second language. And I've certainly noticed that affecting myself. So I have to make a really conscious effort to make sure I read a lot of English, listen to a lot of English, speak it wherever possible, just to make sure that I keep it alive. Secondly, your translator should also be fluent enough in your language, in the source language, in order to be able to understand what you're writing about and to understand what you're trying to say with your writing. Once again, just referring back to what I mentioned before about all the aspects of writing, you also have all that psychology, all that history, all that culture in your writing, and it's important for the translator to be able to bring that across into the target language. And to do that, they need to understand you. Another thing that you'll probably want to do is to check out their experience and their background. What have they already translated? How's it been received? Do they translate books in your genre? So do they understand what you're talking about? It's really important for them to have at least some affinity with your writing, because a translator who cares about what they're working on is going to do a better job than someone who just thinks, meh, you know. And you really don't want to work with someone who is morally opposed to your writing. So this is something quite important to check. You might also like to ask them if they write themselves or if they read widely, because both of these things will also help them to be a better translator. Somebody who reads a lot will have a good feel for language, and somebody who writes a lot as well will probably also be better at bringing across your ideas than someone who doesn't write at all. Another important thing to ask is whether they have a second reader. This is called the sort of 4 eyes principle. And basically, a lot of translators have an arrangement with a colleague to read each other's writing. And this can be really helpful because it can help you to find out if you've made any little mistakes. It's very easy to overlook mistakes once you've become super familiar with the text, or to point out where you could have worded something a bit more elegantly or perhaps made a different word choice. So that's probably also quite an important aspect. And last, but certainly not least, for most people, I should think, the cost. Most translators charge by the word. Prices will vary, of course, depending on the language pair, the translator's background and experience, their training, whether they're an independent operator or coming to you through an agency, in which case the agency will mediate. I can't unfortunately say anything specific about how much it costs because it varies so widely between countries and for all the things that I've mentioned before, but probably your best bet would be to look around, find a few translators who are working in the language pairs that you want to work with and asking them what their prices are. So once you've found your translator, you need to make some decisions about the text. For example, the first one I've got here is what subtype of your target language are you going to choose? For many languages that are spoken around the world, there are different versions of those languages. English is pretty obvious. I've given the example here of US versus UK English, but there's also Australian English, Canadian English, Singapore English. There are a lot of different kinds of English, and you might want to consider which one you want to choose. That has obviously implications for spelling, but it also has implications for the type of terms that you use. For example, say you have a nice Australian friend who's enthusiastically telling you about her going out thongs, and you're an American. This might cause you to raise your eyebrows until your friend shows you her nice going out thongs. Another thing that you might want to consider is names of places and people, whether or not to translate those. This is for practical reasons, on the one hand, leaving the names untranslated kind of more securely situates them in their original context. For example, the book I mentioned previously, the Cat Who Saved Books, all of the characters retain, as far as I know, their original names. On the other hand, however, translating the names may help the reader not to stumble over them while reading, which is not only nice when you're reading to yourself, but also when you're reading aloud. And I've given an example here of some translated names, some names that have been translated from English into Dutch. So, for example, Nanny Og from Terry Pratchett's Discworld has the name Ochinak in Dutch. And our friend Bilbo Baggins of Bag End from Lord of the Rings is called Bilbo Barlings from Barlingshoek. And I find it interesting, actually, that the translator kept the names Bilbo and Frodo, but translated the surnames. Another possible reason for choosing to translate words is sometimes there are words that inadvertently mean something else in your target language. So you want to avoid unwittingly creating hilarity or shock by using some rude word or something in a name. Another thing you might want to think about is, are there any special terms in your writing? Perhaps there are some words that you would rather leave untranslated because they have a particular meaning that enhances your story somehow, or conveys a particular feeling. But there are also foreign words that have found their way into English, and I'm just using this as an example because I happen to translate into English. For example, Schadenfreude. I think pretty much everybody knows what that means, that taking delight in other people's troubles. And I've got here another example from the Cat Who Saved Books. And it's a Japanese term, which I'm probably going to pronounce horribly, hikikomori. And that has the meaning of a young person, mostly a male, who avoids social contact, so stays inside all the time, doesn't go to school, doesn't socialize. And the translator in this book deliberately chose to use that word in the translation because she felt that it was not a word she could efficiently translate or elegantly translate into English. Basically, we don't have a word like that, or not anything that really approaches the meaning that she wanted to bring across. She also knew that this word had now been incorporated into English dictionaries, so there was a fairly good chance that people might already know what it meant. So she chose to keep it. Another question you might want to think about is, how close should the translators stick to the source text when they are working with your writing? On the one hand, you want to make sure that they bring across what you want to communicate. So you might think, oh, that means they have to translate everything exactly as I've written it. But there is also a kind of nice thing about having freedom to translate in a more sort of flowing and freer way. And by that way, finding the best way to communicate your writing. So that's a very personal choice. And that's one that you would have to discuss with your translator and perhaps try a few things out to see how it feels. I have noticed myself, we have in our house some translations of, for example, Terry Pratchett, I've already mentioned, and I was flicking through one of the Dutch copies we have here, and I noticed that the translator had stuck as closely, pretty closely to the original text as possible, and it wasn't at the expense of the humor of the writing. It came across very well, in fact. So that can also work. Okay, and another aspect that you will want to discuss is what kind of contact would you like with your translator during the course of the project? So how often, what kind of contact do you want to talk to them frequently on the phone, or do you want to meet up with them, or are you going to take a hands-off approach and let them just get on with it? It's a personal choice. There are some translators and writers who have very close relationship, and there are others who never speak to each other at all. and whose any contact that they need to make with each other is mediated through a third party, such as a publisher. I think choose whatever works for you, whatever gets your writing translated in the best way possible. And the best way to find that out is to talk to your translator and see how they like to work and see if you can come up with a mutually acceptable solution. It is handy, however, to have some kind of means of contact if the translator should have questions about your writing. Maybe they want to check what you meant by a particular term, or whether something is important for you to stay in the text, or whatever questions. And finally, the delivery of the translated text. That's also something that you can talk to your translator about. Do you want them to deliver chapter by chapter, or do you want to just get the whole thing in one go? How many versions are you going to work with? That kind of thing. This will probably also depend on whether you know anything of the target language yourself. For example, if you are reasonably fluent in the target language, you may want to read along and see if you are getting the feeling that you want in the translation. You might just choose not to do that and just wait until the end and see what the translator's done. And yeah, that's about it for that. And I actually think that I've covered most of the basics of getting your work translated. I've told you a little bit about some of the things that you need to think about with translation. So hopefully you know a little bit more about how it works and what the considerations there are involved. Also about finding a translator. As I mentioned, if you are going to get your work translated through a publisher, there will probably be an entirely different process involved. So not all of this information will be relevant to you, but perhaps it will help in any case to have an idea about what translating involves. Yeah, good luck. And if you have any questions about what I've said today, feel free to ask. And thank you for your attention. Goodbye for now.